Hey, I got a new spubby, and ignore the fan in the room. It's warm in here, and I can't cool it down. I've been trying for 4 years. I wrote this script back in January. Nothing wrong with it. It just so happened a lot more revelations were made, and suddenly my script felt incomplete. Just like my heart. I'll still go over the same points, but to recap from my Bandcamp Spotify videos, record labels are whores. Anyway, this all began in November 2023 when Spotify changed their streaming model. It basically added minimums before they started paying you. This isn't new in terms of dogshit policies. As I mentioned in my prior video on Spoody-Doo, they made a similar push against ambient and drone artists, which they claimed was spam. I won't deny that spam and slush does infect the platform. It's not only ambient and drone, though. I mean, you all saw what happened when Scorpion came out. Even then, they framed it as if their restrictions for noise and specifically reducing minimums would help. In reality, it was clearly high fructose corn syrup and their new Coke formula, baiting with the solution to too many new artists by choking the cash flow to the upper 1%. Here we are now. This makes it harder for smaller and newer artists to thrive on a platform hostile to newcomers as is, but also in a wave of bad news for smaller artists. Nothing new, but my mistake was repeating the obvious because something was missing at the time. Some smaller notes. Spotify in 2020 decided to start pivoting to podcasts. They bought the JRE podcast and it basically became their new cash cow. Since then, they basically renewed the deal, and what good timing, because it made me have to search slightly more to find the original story, fucking asshole. It seems stupid and almost dystopian, but it's a lot worse. See, Spotify is a puppet to the music labels. Not in a conspiracy way, but in a business way. Before Spotify, Apple had iTunes, and in order to sell it, had to basically convince labels that 99 cents per song was a good deal.
His vision for the company in this new decade involved creating a digital hub for a given user's media. So Jobs started going to all of the labels and hashing out deals to get legal music on their own music store. In time, Apple was able to secure deals with all of the labels and the musicians who had been hesitant to accept digital downloads as the future. And with the iTunes store, you could easily purchase new albums or even individual songs. That last one was a major sticking point for Jobs, as was the pricing of 99 cents for one song from any artist.
But eventually that price went back up. However, even if artists were being underballed, that wasn't because of Apple. That was because labels want to choke their artists out of money for constant profits and shareholder simping. Later, in the 2000s, Apple started to move from iTunes and the iPod over to the iPhone. In that time, Spotify became a startup and by 2013 was in business. The streaming platform already existed somewhat, but Spotify was a much stronger target. Labels swooped in and basically tied them into deals that kept them alive but didn't award them any profit. It was a parasitic relationship. Even as Spotify grew and grew, trying to attach to larger and larger artists, the labels always choked any earnings through them. Spotify has fairly low rates, but that's only because labels force that since they learned from iTunes. Which is why, after half a decade of operation, they moved to podcasts in order to find some market labels didn't own, hence why Spotify moved to podcasts. They're not the only ones. This isn't meant to be sympathetic to Spotify. The topic of Spotify also extends next to Apple Music, the sequel to iTunes. Like most sequels, it was disappointing and we all regret it. In January 2024, Apple made the choice to start focusing hard on spatial audio mixes. What are they? Look, it's those alternative mixes where instead of stereo, it's Dolby Surround Sound 7.1, except expensive. Indie labels and smaller artists actually started to worry after royalty changes were made because it was expensive with little return. You know, because it was stupid. The controversy wasn't new either. It's fair to assume the chokehold labels put on Spotify is also on other streaming services, which is why large pop stars get those alternative mixes to their albums. Artists are encouraged to release more albums and more songs, more mixes, more remixes, to constantly fill up every possible niche and not miss out on any money. Which is how Apple Music essentially added a paywall to have a chance to get noticed because, of course, their spatial mixes are given higher priority. When it comes to rates, streaming services generally have low rates. YouTuber Music has the lowest, Spotify and Apple Music have mediocre rates, Tidal have moderate rates, and nobody really gives a shit about the rest. Do you really care about Samsung Music, Google Play Music, Adobe Music, Amazon Music, OnePlus Music, and Sony Music? I made up 2 of those. Bandcamp was the only one with regular rates, but I wouldn't buy that. I do plan on following up my Bandcamp videos soon, by the way. Again, they're all low to appease the labels, which also includes exclusivity. You know how The Office became extremely popular under Netflix, and then when Peacock swooped it up, it suddenly lost all momentum? Every now and then, mostly on Bandcamp and YouTube Music, I run into a blotched out album, especially on Bandcamp, Both Spotify and Apple Music have this too. From what I've heard, Tidal does at times too.
Being available on the platform anymore. Tidal will just grey it out, which is such a tease. You can see the song that you want to listen to, but it's just blocked out for stuffy corporate reasons. Like all of a sudden an artist changes music labels that doesn't support your music streaming platform of choice anymore, and boom, it's just gone.
Not too long ago, I was going through Dog Fashion Disco's discography and found out that their album, Experiment in Embryos, or specifically the original The Embryos in Bloom, and found my options were to buy it physically or buy Apple Music. Naturally, I found the band's address and submitted a civil complaint to the BBC. Then I woke up. I have the CD, but I still haven't listened to it because I don't have a CD player. It does taste pretty funny. Unless I'm exploring a band's discography, I'm not going to go hunting where it's available. Even worse when there's 2 songs available, but the rest is missing. In the case of Slow Poem for Stiebler, I don't really mind much since it's a sample and they're very small. They provide a demo, which I at least understand. Give me one single fucking reason why the Body Krieg is only available in 2 songs. Who the fuck cares about the Body Krieg's copyright that much? Eat it, asshole. There were 2 realizations that came to me which brought me back to the subject. 1, Spotify is not a sustainable business, more on that later. 2, Spotify's business model is based on personal monopolies. The business model for tobacco companies isn't about getting new customers, but retaining and pickpocketing their current customers. Interestingly, this business model has expanded into streaming. I primarily use Bandcamp and YouTube Music. YouTube Music has all my playlists and collections, while Bandcamp is where I purchase albums either digitally or physically. Depending on which market is being inflated, it has another collection. The thing is, I don't use YouTube Music because it's a good service. I started listening to music on YouTube because it was the app that I had. It was free, and I tolerated ads in my free spirit young self, ignoring the trauma. I started making playlists of songs I liked into a story. I had a collection of my favorite songs. Eventually started adding albums to save for later. When YouTube Music went from shit to tolerable, I jumped ship. I do pay for premium, but I only started because I wanted to watch Smiling Friends. It's not a scam. But in the same way, penicillin is not a scam. All my stuff is on YouTube in the same way somebody's Xbox has all their stuff. Except mine is on a drive I don't own. It's a personal monopoly, and you pay to keep the stuff you don't own. It's cloud storage that, sure, wouldn't be hard to convert to analog provided you have the time, money, and disk space. And, of course, YouTube doesn't provide a direct way because then you wouldn't use the service. That's how the operating system works. You have an easy place where everything is that you pay to have access to. If you use Spotify, it's because you used it first. In that sense, when Spotify and Apple make alternative mixings, they're taking advantage of parasocial relationships and personal monopolies to get people to waste their time with new mixes. But now you can hear the electrical wire. On the subject of Spotify having an unsustainable business model, which is something I've been hearing since 2018, I don't buy it. An unsustainable business model doesn't matter if it still makes money. For reasons, Spotify is under the chains of larger labels, but they're also sort of a puppet. For years, labels had tight-knit control over their assets up until the great Napster of '98.
Let's first acknowledge, the primary reason the industry was raking in the dollars was because the major labels own the distribution with an iron fist. You want a song? Well, you get in your brand new Ford Focus, you go into your nearest Circuit City, you buy the full CD for $16.
Despite their attempts, they lost the war because while they could convince Metallica, Paul McCartney, and Mike Love, they could not convince the general public. Music labels are in a weird place. Video game companies have the benefit that their player base loves their logos since they played them as children. More companies have their top actors and business folk to back them. Music labels don't have the grace of audiences or artists to back them besides the top 1%. Spotify may be their puppet and target, but they aren't absolved of blame. They are still fairly anti-artist and profit-driven. If they have a bad business model, that doesn't matter because the labels need Spotify. In that sense, their unsustainable business is at the expense of label prosperity and control. In that sense, it all doesn't matter because all the labels want is control of their clients. This is why song traders sought out Bandcamp, because it was an asset the industry at large didn't have their filthy hands involved in. It's not a conspiracy, it's business. Finally, there is the claim that Spotify devalues music. I did not read the entire claim of that, but just from that blurb, they aren't wrong. It is extreme in some regards because good music can never be devalued, but that's not what it means. Literally, they mean by price. Music is worthless on Spotify because there are infinite options that all sound very close to the same. There are a million remixes, playlists, genres, and songs. Artists are constantly releasing albums filled with songs in no particular order, reliant on hype cycles, press tours, and controversy. In a way, they did.
Piece by Michael Nelson over at Stereogum talking about how distorted Views' record-breaking streaming numbers were, but he sacrificed the world stage for a niche platform built to enhance the perceived value of a luxury brand aimed at higher-end consumers with middle-brow tastes. There's one more reason why this album defined the business end of music, and that's its length. This thing is long as hell, but it isn't long because the songs are long, it's long because there are 20 tracks on it. This was one of the first instances of artists stretching out their track listings to get more plays and more revenue, and it was a practice that Drake would continue going forward, crafting projects that were less like albums and more like playlists.
And they needed to because Spotify's business model is parasitic in nature. Since 2016, music has become more and more worthless and pointless to the casual consumers. It doesn't matter what you release, but when. Every major album is a playlist with a million songs, endless hype from the most dedicated, and constant press tours to keep the fire alive. It's not all devoid of hope. Music still has value, and we're not approaching a collapse where we all listen to white noise in silence. The only part that matters is the brand identity and its branches, the interactions and advertisements for the most dedicated stans and collectors. Spotify is a music streaming business that hates music. It really sucks because overall, I like the technology. I hate to admit it, but while I hate the streaming model, I adore the technology of it. Streaming for movies feels more like cable, even before people were saying that because of how crap was flooded onto the market and how monopolized it was. However, for music, I think streaming is a borderline genius technology. One problem with radio is that most of it sucks because it's predetermined. Manual CD playing and manual playlists can work, but only if you have the music to add it. Also, mixtapes, digital audio players, CD players, and record players can be expensive, especially if you need a lot of it to get the best. Music is bite-sized and perfect for experiencing doses like this, and it is a flawed technology, but more because of who is in charge. And even without corporate interference, there were still problems with who was the most popular. Even through that, the amount of music I have access to allowed me to be in music. Without it, I would have probably just listened to the radio. If it all went away, I don't know if I would listen to music to the extent I used to when I first fell into the scene. I don't just mean music everyone listens to. To be fair, most of that is through recommendations, exploring, and sometimes scrolling through Bandcamp. However, I can't really imagine something better for music. The issue isn't that it doesn't make money, it's who is bottlenecking that cash flow and where it is going. Not everyone really has access to big scenes of venues and music of local bands. In a lot of cases, we just don't have that, and it doesn't seem like many people want to bother with it. When I made my Bandcamp incident video, I was kinda scared to call for a pro-union stance because at the time, to me, it seemed so radical. Thankfully, there's a fairly large labor movement brewing, though how far it'll go depends on whether B-17 bombers will be used like that last time we tried this shit. However, unionization won't budge the industry nor Spotify. Frankly, Spotify and the labels own an illegal monopoly. Regulations are needed. There just isn't a way for newer and smaller artists to thrive, and larger artists are incentivized to flood the platform with crap for their ultimate market share. Labels that want to compete are either at the risk of being bought out or just being destroyed. Despite the fact that system is unfair to them because it requires them to constantly spew out content because any alternative is irrelevant to the industry. The smaller artist is not profitable to the business metrics until they are, and when they stop being so, they will be spat out and abandoned. For consumers, we're stuck paying for services that we can't stop using, with music behind growing paywalls, constant stupid obstacles, which prevent smaller artists from making a dime. The largest artists are emboldened and protected only at the cost that they spew out garbage constantly, lest they become one of the borings. Not only do we need to break up these monopolies, there needs to be regulations. I like streaming, and I like the ability to find any artist at any time. I don't want that to go away, but I would also like those artists to have a livable fucking wage, and that won't happen until we force these corporations to. We need to both respect the consumer and the producer, and the middleman needs to respect both of us.
The MPEG Audio Layer 3, or the MP3. The idea with the MP3 at the time was that the encoding tools would be unavailable to the public, but the decoding tools would be free to use. If the public at large was able to not just access MP3s, but create and share them, that would be pretty bad for the music industry, wouldn't it? Then, in 1997, as Karl-Heinz put it to NPR, some Australian college student figured out the encoding software and uploaded it to a random US university site for anyone to download. The MP3 was leaked. Karlheinz and his team did everything they could from there to stop this from happening, and once it became clear that they couldn't stop it, they went to convince the people who this would affect the most, the music industry. Now, on one hand, it's worth recognizing the absolute trash fire of a hand MPEG and the music industry were just handed. But on the other hand, when Karlheinz explained what was coming and how to prepare, music executives didn't listen. In his book, How Music Got Free, author Stephen Witt describes a meeting Karlheinz had with the Recording Industry Association of America, or RIAA. He outlined the threat that the MP3 could pose if it ran wild, but the RIAA didn't budge. But they also had concerns that Karlheinz's solution would require them to pony up the cash. Oh, also, their tech people, their engineers, hated the MP3 and didn't want a format that would sacrifice the CD's audio fidelity. Plus, the industry was still raking in ludicrous profits, which of course meant that they would always rake in ludicrous profits. They made the long box, they were never gonna fail. But that would change very soon, in 2 years to be specific. I'm going to be slightly hyperbolic right now. Every failure of the music industry from the past 2 decades stems from what happened in 1997.